Hello and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on real-world data governance, practical strategies for data ownership. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18 Group, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Unfortunately, Scott Peachy, who was planning to join us, is not well, so he won't be with us today. But indeed, we have other expert speakers, and they are Dan Power, former Managing Director and Head of Data Governance at State Street Global Markets, and Nick Brandreth, Data Governance Cloud Director at OneTrust. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in just a moment, but first a few hints and tips for you. On your screen to the right of the video, you'll see a Slido section. Two panels there, one for your questions. Please feel free to ask our speakers any questions as we go along. We'll take those questions sometime before the end of the webinar so that we can be sure to answer as many as we can. The other section on the Slido panel is for audience polls. We'll be running 3 polls today, so do please vote in those polls. It's always good to hear where you are in terms of what we're talking about. So take part, always good to hear from you. Enough from me, and let me ask our speakers to introduce themselves. Dan, would you like to start, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Dan Power, formerly with State Street Global Markets in the role of Managing Director and Head of Data Governance, effectively the Chief Data Officer for that business unit. Prior to that, I had a consulting firm in the early days of master data management and data strategy and data governance and data quality from 2007 to 2016. And prior to that, worked for firms like Dun & Bradstreet and CSC Consulting and Deloitte. And very excited to be here today. This is my favorite topic after my kids, and looking forward to a lively discussion, although I'm sure we'll miss Scott. We'll just have a little bit more ground to cover and a little bit more time to address questions. So please, if you're in the audience, start thinking about questions and getting them into the chat.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Nick Brandreth. I'm a Global Cloud Director of our data governance technologies here at OneTrust. I'm basically responsible for a lot of go-to-market strategies, both pre-sales with customers and post-sales with customers. Been in the space for about 5 years, and prior to that, 17 in information security. So I've seen a lot of good practices, bad practices, maturing practices, a lot of scar tissue along the way, and some really good programs in place. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm excited to have this discussion with Dan, and looking forward to a great session today.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Plenty of expertise in the room. I'm looking forward to the discussion too. But let's get started with an audience question. It asks, to what extent has your organization developed effective data governance? So while you think about that and cast your votes, let me come over to Dan to set the scene and share his view on the state of play on data governance and ownership across capital markets.
You know, I think people are starting to wake up that capital markets particularly is all based on data. You know, it's transactions, it's trades, it's foreign currency positions, etc. And, you know, we used to joke that we were a bank that didn't realize it was also a technology company. And that, you know, nowadays, you know, things that you used to think of as, well, that's something that Facebook and Google and Apple and those types of companies have to worry about and think about. No, everybody has to think about it now. Data is a huge asset to the organization. It's interesting that it's still not valued on the corporate balance sheet. Although it's been predicted that that would happen, it hasn't happened yet. But if you're thinking about an asset, you know, I'm reminded of an old story from early days of Microsoft. Microsoft was making money hand over fist, and they didn't really know what to do with it. So what they would do is they'd trot down to the local bank and they'd get a certificate of deposit. And this was back in kind of the pre-digital days. So they'd like get a certificate of deposit for like $20 million, and they would just pop it in a folder and off they go. So at the end of the quarter once, they were trying to account for and inventory all these CDs. And so they couldn't find one. And they literally had lost a certificate of deposit for $20 million. It had fallen down in the crack between 2 filing cabinets, and it took them days to find it. And, you know, data is like that. We have these assets that are undervalued or not valued. We don't really know how to manage them very well. It's new to a lot of companies. and yet not valuing them and not managing them is a huge risk for the organization. So I think we have to start thinking of data governance as the finance for information assets. And people would ask me, well, when are we going to be done with data governance? And I would say, well, when are you going to be done with finance? You're never going to be done. It's always going to be, getting to a higher level of maturity and making it more pervasive and more automatic and more automated. But still, people are going to have to be thinking about data and information and knowledge and, making decisions about it and, getting people smarter about it and so on, because you can't all of a sudden you're not going to arrive at nirvana and the data will somehow take care of itself. That doesn't happen. So data governance has been around as a discipline for quite a while now, and we're starting to see companies that not only accept that they have to do it, but they're actually getting pretty good at it. So there's lots of best practices to pass on to folks that are earlier in the life cycle. And it's for whatever reason, I'm not really sure why, but it's always been an area that I'm very passionate about. Data itself and the governance and management of it, because I think that's a great skill and that's a great competency to develop as an organization. And if you say, well, there are these companies out there like Google and Facebook and Apple and so on, well, why wouldn't you want to be more like them? Why wouldn't you want to be more mature and better and more, literate and fluent at dealing with data because of the huge competitive advantage that would represent?
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And Nick, what do you see when you're out and about in terms of, how capital markets are getting on with governance and ownership?
Yeah, I think some of the points that Dan made there are really spot on. I love the use of data as an asset, right? And if you think of an asset, financial markets, right? What do you do with an asset? You take care of it, you invest in it, you try and make it grow, and you try and increase the value of it, which is really the main strategy that pretty much every organization has, right? Whether it's to increase loyalty, whether it's to make better decisions, drive revenue, acquire companies, whatever it may be, you're leveraging data. So you need to invest in it. You need to invest in it from a policy and a people perspective. You need to invest in it from a technology perspective, and et cetera. However, you also need to take care of it, right? You have to an extent, a fiduciary responsibility to treat that data accordingly and to protect that data accordingly. And because data has evolved and because the way the organizations need to use the data and want to use the data has evolved, what we're seeing also is an evolution of data governance programs. And Dan's spot on right about the data governance as a discipline has been around for quite a long time, but we're definitely seeing more stakeholders, more alignment needed across the organization because data touches everybody from finance to marketing to sales to IT to information security to privacy. That critical need to take care of that data responsibly, use that data responsibly, is extremely important.
Okay.
Yeah. If I can just build on that real quick. The idea of having these assets and not protecting them, one thing people are saying now is, well, as we get ready for AI, as most corporations are starting to gear up and get ready for implementations of large language models or generative AI or whatever aspect of AI and machine learning they might be doing, is, well, how's the data? This whole structure of AI and machine learning really rests on the foundation of the data. So if you don't have that in place, if you don't have strong data quality, and I would go so far as to say, the ethical use of AI is in a way also a data quality issue. It's about fitness for purpose and, being able to, either be free of bias or be able to identify where the bias is. Because we all know garbage in, garbage out. And if you're having your source data that has historical bias embedded in it, then that's going to be reflected in the output of the AI model. So I think we need to get smarter about how to trap for that and fix that before turning that over as training data to the AI. And the idea of we have these assets and we're not managing them. I think that's thankfully, it's a concept that not many people are on board with anymore. But you have to think about something. Is it okay from a security perspective? Is it okay from a privacy perspective? Is it okay from a governance perspective? And then you kind of have the specific discussion about, well, we want to use this data. Well, okay, we've got that triage of questions about, is that a permitted purpose, or, does that make sense? Sometimes people don't even know what the source of the data should be. And that's where data governance can help them and say, look, for this purpose, what you want to do, whether it be a dashboard or an AI model or report or another system, the best source for that data is here, and here's why. And being able to answer that from a data catalog and show them, the trust score or the reliability score of that data from a data quality perspective is a great way to answer those questions beyond just saying, you can't use this data. Usually the answer no is not going to work. People have legitimate businesses and operations and so on that they have to run. It's more about no, but, and then pointing them to the right place, or guiding their practices and helping them learn. Because people aren't out there deliberately trying to misuse data, at least not most of the time. You might have the occasional disgruntled employee or Chinese hacker or whatever. But the idea is, they don't understand data well enough to be able to make good decisions, at least not right now. So they need help from someone who is kind of a data guide. And data governance, I think, provides that function, is empowering the business through better operations, because, better access to data. At one time, people would say in the business, well, the data lives on the computers are managed by IT, IT should own this data. And I think what they've realized is they don't want to do that, because ideally the business owns and operates and manages the data with assistance from IT as, technical stewards of the data. But they don't want to, abdicate responsibility altogether and hand ownership over to IT, because they know that the assets are too crucial really for them to do that.
Okay, thank you. May we have the poll results, please, to see how our audience is getting on? And Nick, would you like to comment on that? Well, there's work going on, more work needed. Does that seem familiar to you?
Yeah, definitely seems familiar to me. I've seen that and hear that quite frequently, for sure. And it's just like any type of program within an organization, data governance, right? It's a continuous improvement model. And because of technology and innovation and velocity of data in the organization, to Dan's point, and this will probably come up a little bit more in the next few questions, but to Dan's point, things like AI and responsible use and ethical use of AI is just pointing to, hey, we need to have a lot more work around this.
Yeah, that's an interesting slide too, because if you think of the answers representing the maturity states 1 through 5, it looks like basically no one is at a 5. Very few, I forget the exact percentage because it's not on the screen right now, but few are at 4, and most are at the kind of 2 or 3 stage. So, to a good extent or to a limited extent, more work or much more work is needed. To me, that would represent steps 2 or 3 in the maturity model. Being at the planning state is basically at a 1, and being at the greatest extent possible would be at a 5. So it kind of represents, almost a distributed bell curve. And what's ironic is, when I was a consultant before joining State Street, I worked with Cisco, and I did some work with them, back in probably 2005 or 6. And then 10 years later, I ran into the same folks from Cisco at a conference, and I sat down and we had coffee, and I asked them, how are you doing with your data governance and, customer data management? And they said, well, on a scale of 1 to 5, we know we started out at a 1. That's kind of when we worked with you and you helped give us direction and ideas and strategy and so on. Now we're at a 4. And I was actually very encouraged by that, because after 10 years of organized work on data management and customer data in particular, they knew they were still not quite there. They were at a 4 out of 5 after 10 years of effort, with budgets and headcount and everything else. So I bring that up sometimes to remind people that this stuff is hard. And, I know in a lot of places, operations is hard, HR is hard, finance is hard. Everything we do in business requires, lifting weight and moving it from one place to another on our backs. This data management stuff is hard. And, to say, hey, honestly, to, an outside party that we know and can be very honest with, we're still only at a 4 out of 5 after 10 years of effort. That was very striking to me. And it was very honest and humble on their part to say, we know we still have work to do. Because a lot of this, it's all about how often do you do this? Do you do it never, kind of sometimes, frequently, very frequently, always? Being honest and answering, like, how often do you, do, good catalog and metadata management? How often do you do, strong data quality? It's probably not always. And there's still a lot of opportunity for things to be automated, for things to be better documented. One of the biggest ROI points for us in doing data governance was increasing the productivity of the IT and development teams because they weren't starting from scratch. Normally when an IT project would come up, they would have to dedicate resources to do some reverse engineering about the system they were going to go work on. But before they could start developing new code to extend the system, they had to first figure out what had been done before by reading over the existing source code. What's the data structure? What comes in, what goes out, where are the data quality checks, those types of things. We could actually answer that for them on day one. So they either wouldn't need those people, the data analysts, they would have had to staff, or they wouldn't have to spend that time. Or they could say, hey, we're looking to do this work. And we could say, well, if you eliminate these things, which are already there, but you just didn't know about, guess what? You're going to save, 20% of your planned effort. So that increase in productivity of IT, it wasn't that it was an unplanned consequence, but it was definitely welcome. Anytime you can say, hey, your $1 million project budget really only needs to be 800,000. They would all, they became our biggest fans. IT was like very resistant at first and skeptical, and hey, this looks like bureaucracy, and we're supposed to be agile, and why are you making us do all this documentation? But once they were on the other side of it and they were able to use those assets and that metadata and those resources, they became huge fans of it. They were like, well, why would we ever not want to do this again? And they would almost be like pushing data governance into things that we actually hadn't thought of, but they were aware of, and in terms of documenting authorized sources and making sure controls were in place and so on. And it was really interesting to see that turnaround over only the span of a couple of years. Honestly, it didn't take that long to make them become huge believers in data governance.
Good to hear. Let's move on. And Nick, I'll come to you. Dan and you have said some of the things in the poll rather reflects it. So the question is, therefore, why should FIs be investing and implementing what we might call real world data governance now?
Yeah, so there's a couple things at play here. Dan mentioned it a little bit in the last question. Some of his comments around, AI is coming. We got to get ready for it. Organizations have faced, FIs have faced like a lot of technical innovation. There's adoption of new data lakehouse technologies. There's adoption of cloud technologies, migration to cloud technologies. All of these types of technologies are needed to be able to meet the CDO strategy or the data owner strategy on how we're going to use the data, how we're going to leverage the data, how are we going to share the data back and forth between business partners. On top of that, as I kind of mentioned before, data has changed. It used to be the data that we were worried about was things like first name, last name, account number, credit card number, taxpayer identification, whatever. That type of data would be determined as highly sensitive, right, and critical. Non-public material information, that type of thing. Now, because data is so personalized, things like behavioral preferences, things like dietary preference, which could infer religion, all of these types, zip code, all of these types of things start to become these pieces of data start to change the meaning of how we're looking at data, how we're using data, and how data can be weaponized or used against an individual. So being able to control that data and being able to control it and adopt the technologies and be able to use the data with the right type of velocity and agility within the organization really requires organizations to start adopting data governance programs if they haven't, which I typically see companies in two tranches, right? One is never had anything in place, need to do something because we got to use the data and we got to use it responsibly and effectively. Or the second tranche, and this is we see this a lot in organizations that are very highly regulated with control heavy type of organization. They likely have had some type of existing data governance program in place, but because of things like GDPR and AI and all of these different types of new variables, they've had to expand that program, and those programs are evolving. So it's becoming very critical for widespread adoption of data governance within every organization.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to stick with you, Nick, for a moment. You've talked about that. We've both all talked about where we're going, AI, more regulation, and so on. So going back to sort of base layer, what are the essential elements of a regulatory compliant data governance strategy? What do people really got to think about that?
Sure. I like to kind of think of this from a very baseline type of perspective, in looking at five simple questions. To effectively manage, monitor, and control your data, you have to be able to answer 5 questions out of the gate. The first one is, what data do I have? Do I have data that's breaking a privacy policy? Do I have data that could potentially, in a source, introduce bias from an AI perspective? Do I have data that is not meeting a certain policy, data protection policy? So what data do I have? And then where is it? Where is it from an asset perspective? Do I have sensitive data sitting out in an S3 bucket that's got open access to it? And also within that source itself, right? These lovely problematic things called open text boxes tend to create a lot of problems for organizations. So understanding that, hey, in a comments field, we've got account numbers or policy numbers because the service doesn't have the capability of capturing that in the right place. So an agent or a customer success person is putting data in a free-form text field. So being able to understand what data you have and where it's at is really critical. The third one is, what purpose do I have for using this data, for collecting and using this data? And this has been a need and a requirement for a lot of data privacy regulations like GDPR. But to Dan's point earlier, as organizations are thinking of AI and saying, hey, we watched retail adopt big data computing concepts with not a lot of controls in place, and things kind of went haywire. We need to make sure that we have a lot of controls in place when we're adopting AI and AI technologies. Understanding purpose of data is really, really, really critical. The fourth one is, how effective are my data protection policies? I have basic data protection policies in place, like retention of data. How long do I keep it? Like encryption or anonymization policies. All data should be restricted and clear. But because of velocity, because of that open text problem, because of a number of different issues, I can't validate empirically how effective those policies are, how effectively I am protecting the data. And the final one is like, what things can I fix? Where should I focus on in order to create the greatest impact to the program right away? So like from a compliance perspective and a data governance program, if you can't answer those questions around the data, implementing data governance is going to become, from a compliance perspective, it's going to become quite challenging.
Okay, Dan, as a practitioner yourself, what would you say to that? What would you add?
Well, I think you have to work with the regulators because they're going to tell you where you're drifting off the mark. And if you look at an organization like Citi, for example, they got a $400 million fine for lack of a rigorous data governance and risk management program. So that's always, for me as a practitioner, that's a good thing because now I have the stick, and I don't have to be the bad guy. I can say, hey, look, I don't think the SEC or FINRA or whatever, the Fed, whomever, I don't think they're going to like this. I think you need to work on this. And the other, allies that I have within the organization, as much as it pains me to say it, is internal audit and compliance. That I can say, hey, we have a policy and this is how I interpret it. And audit agrees with me. And we don't think you're complying with that policy, although you might think that you are. So let's have a conversation about that because, when you're talking about risk management or, satisfying a regulator, a lot of times it's not the provider of the data's opinion that matters. It's the consumer or the regulator's opinion that's going to override. So in the end, those are great questions like where is the data? What do we have? Where is it located? What is the purpose? Essentially what you're trying to answer is, are we in compliance? And I drove for 6 years to try to get a business unit more and more and more into compliance with regulations, of course, with internal policies, of course, but also with just common sense. A lot of times, the people at Citi, they should have known what they were doing wasn't adequate, and it presented a huge risk. So I would say, these are questions that data governance practitioners are very familiar with, and they have these internal allies within the organization that can back them up. And they have to go to the business people and IT people and say, look, it's not that what you're doing is wrong. You're just not doing enough. And usually they'll be like, yeah, we know. We've been trying to get better for a couple of years, and it's great that you're giving us this ammunition, because that will help us go get budget to fix it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let's move on with another audience poll question now, and it is, what are the challenges of implementing data governance across your organization? You've ever had some of these already. Please feel free to tick as many of the boxes as are appropriate to your organization. And while you do that, I'd like to come back to Nick to see how he sees the challenges of implementing and sustaining data governance across a financial institution. Obviously, we've talked about some of those, but where are the painful bits? Where are the holes? Where can it go wrong?
Yeah, so what's interesting, I think, about this question, and it ties a little bit into what Dan was just commenting about IT and InfoSec and other owners across the organization, is oftentimes data governance programs are viewed as being very big. They are big programs, right? But they're viewed as being very big, and finding value, getting everybody on board can be a challenge. So when we see an organization, I've seen organizations go in and take an approach of, let's get a tactical win. I heard this at a conference in DC last December, where the keynote speaker commented about an offensive program versus a defensive program, right? Being able to go out and show quick value to the org is extremely important. So find a quick tactical win, focus on an environment or a project that's a high value project, and then tackle that from there. And what that enables you to do is it enables governance to get really tight alignment with its key stakeholders. Like Dan, I know you have comments around this, but privacy, InfoSec, data governance all have kind of a stake here. But it also gives you the ability to go out and get alignment across other really critical business partners. Marketing, IT is an extremely critical business partner by going out and getting those quick tactical wins.
Okay. How do you see the challenges here, Dan?
Well, I think Nick touched on it with, the business value and being able to point to the business value that this is generating. Because at first it's going to seem like a pipe dream. Like, how does data governance generate value? They essentially view it as a tax on the organization. And what I would say, well, the only thing worse than data governance is not having it, because there's an even bigger tax out there, which is the productivity tax and the risk tax and the regulatory tax of not doing this stuff. So yes, it's a pain. It's like filing your tax return. Who likes to do that unless you're a tax accountant? But if you don't do it, guess what? The IRS is going to come knocking at your door eventually and say, hey, where are your tax returns from 2015 to 2022? So what we want to do is eventually get them around to seeing it as a value and say, okay, great. You've automated the filing of our tax returns. That's great. We don't have to worry about it anymore. So from a data capture, metadata capture, data quality control, data lineage, being able to automate a lot of that capability or at least take it off the back of the people that were doing it, because they obviously weren't doing it, because that's why it wasn't there to begin with. So there's lots of challenges, but the biggest challenge for me has always been showing the value. And then eventually they see it, and then the light bulb goes off, and they're like, this is great. Thank you so much. And, and then the opposite happens. Then everything becomes a data governance problem, and you get sucked into things that, data governance really has no business doing. But, it's like if it has the word data in it, and, almost everything does, then, you should be responsible for it. So that's actually, I welcome that, because then you can prune it back and say, well, this is more of an IT thing, or this is more of an operations thing. But the challenges, at least at first, the first couple of years of data governance, there are many, many challenges to overcome.
Okay, those are all very, very good points. Let's see what our audience is saying in terms of the challenges. Oh, back to your data silos. Dan, what would you say about those results?
Well, that's very consistent with what I've seen. The silos, of course, we call them islands of data. And what I used to try to get people to do is to say, look, don't necessarily try to destroy the silos. They're usually there for a good reason, but build a bridge across the top. Almost think of like the Florida Keys and how there's, I forget the name of the highway. I think it might be 1A, but it goes from island to island, and you can get from point A to point B across the bridges and get from one silo to another. The buy-in and budget is a very big problem, because people are skeptical. They kind of sit there with their arms crossed in the meeting, and their micro expressions are shaking their head. They won't look you in the eye. Eventually, you have to get over that and get through and say, look, you don't have to believe me. Just look at the data. And limited understanding, that's definitely a big issue, because it's a scalability problem. We had 3,000 databases at my last company. And just trying to govern them all to the same level of detail was just super challenging. Manual processes, we would see, as many as 75% of our processes were, at least partly manual. The cultural support, I think, will come over time, because part of getting to be a more mature data governance organization is baking things in, and we would call it making it part of the DNA, where they just happen automatically. It's just part of the mindset now. Like I think Nick was saying earlier, that involving InfoSec, involving privacy, involving data governance, et cetera, are all just automatic reactions of the organization. Not to the point where you don't need them anymore, but you don't have to remind people every time that, hey, don't forget to involve privacy in your project. So that's a good thing when you get to that point. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for voting in the poll. Let's move on. And Nick, coming back to you, let's consider another aspect of data governance and the challenges and resolutions of ensuring data ownership. This is always a very difficult question. So what do you see there? What are the challenges and how they can be resolved?
I mean, I think a lot of it also goes back to that last poll that we just saw, right? And was separations, who owns what type of data within the organization, but also who should own what type of data within the organization comes into play. And when you look at things like manual processes, lack of controls, all of those things that were on those are all challenges that lead organizations to understanding that data ownership and ensuring the data ownership. And don't forget there's like regulatory and risk based types of issues that are involved with that as well, that make that a challenge.
Okay, Dan, thank you. You've obviously had a lot of practice here. What do you consider the problems of ensuring data ownership, and how can you resolve them?
I think the first point is to try to make it clear what you mean by data ownership. And sometimes people they think of it as, okay, great, I own this data, I can do anything I want with it. And making it clear, data ownership does not include the right to be destructive or to vandalize that data. You quote unquote own it. The other thing is also make sure you're not assigning the ownership too high. We had a number of people that would say, all the data in this particular system, so everything from soup to nuts, is all owned by the business unit CEO. And we would say, really? Why don't you just make it the chairman of the whole company? What we would try to do is balance, So the system owner and the data owner often were not the same. The system owner typically would be an IT person responsible for keeping the thing up and running. The data owner would usually be a business person. Sometimes they were an IT person that had migrated into the business, and that was okay because they had already made that switch years ago, and now they were considered to be in the business. But they had to take ownership from a like, who am I going to go to if I need to have this fixed? If I find a
Mm,
problem downstream and I trace it backward and I say, oh, okay, it's coming from the system called, FinX or whatever. Who's the owner of that, and who do I go to? Because for me, that's what ownership meant: is who can fix it or who can kind of get the process started to fix it if there is a problem. And it's usually not a technical thing. Like you were bringing up that idea of looking at the open text fields. That's key because those are used as buckets where people put things where they can't put it anywhere else. And so
mhm,
that's really a business question and an IT question is, hey, maybe we should open up a field and create a new column in the database and a new, field on the screen to store that information so we don't have to put it in the common field. And, part of it is looking at things like just system design being out of date. We would look at the US state field, and a lot of times we would see country codes and we would say, oh, this system was designed just for use in the US. And once the business expanded beyond that, no one ever went back and added the country code to the database. So
mhm,
of course they're putting, the country code for Mexico in the state field. And it's just kind of pure common sense that they would do that, but no one knows that they're doing it. And so the ownership question is really, who on the business side is going to be the champion to fix this? And, we can't have it be someone downstream. We can't have it be IT. We can't have it be data governance. Usually the owner has to come from the business, but not be so high level that they don't even know the issue. So usually what I would say is whoever they propose first, the answer is usually no, and it's usually one of that person's direct reports, or maybe even one of that person's direct reports. So one or two levels lower in the organization, you don't want to have, you can't have it be a new hire, like who doesn't know anything yet. But if someone's been in their role for 5 years, and they're intimately involved in that part of the business, they're a good candidate to be a data owner. And you have to make sure they know what the support is for them. Because, like, you're not asking them to move mountains. You're saying, look, with the IT folks and the data governance folks and the risk and compliance and everyone else, this is what that ownership means. And this is the support you'll have around that. And usually, once you explain that, they're like, oh. And the other thing I would point out is that usually they're already doing it. Those are not new things. We're just calling
mhm.
them something new or making it explicit. Whereas before it was just an implicit part of their job that, of course, they would take care of all these things. Now we're saying as part of a more formalized governance approach, we're making the ownership of that more formalized too. But guess what? You were kind of already doing it.
Mhm.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And back to some real nuts and bolts stuff again. And Nick, what types of techs and solutions and skills are helpful here for both or either of data governance and data ownership?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and it goes back to some of the points that we had discussed earlier around, data governance is it's an organizational wide initiative. There are um, um, different stakeholders involved here as well. So looking at the technology stack, I think is something that organizations from an overall data governance perspective have to consider right away. Is this a federated model, or can I go out and just get a single technology? And the reality is it has to be a federated model because there are technologies out there that are really good at protecting the data, but they're not good at understanding what the data is,
Mm,
where it is, like why you're using that data. There's technologies out there that are really good at providing a self-service catalog and that type of thing, but they don't encrypt the data, right? So and especially with the volume of data that organizations are dealing with now, the variety of data that organizations are wanting to use now, and that velocity, data lakehouse projects are, like, I think, the epitome of where you're looking at the intersection of technology. So you need to look at different types of technologies that can help you in these various different type of tranches, and not think of like, hey, I'm going to put out an RFP for a data governance technology and it's going to solve all of these things. Understanding that quality and lineage, and all of these various different factors are going to be different technologies, but really critically, they all have to be part of this reference architecture, and they should all interconnect, because I have to have agility. I have to create a baseline of, this is what good is in my data lake house from a data governance perspective. This is what good is. Now I need to control. I need to control drift from that baseline, so that the business can move quickly.
Okay, that's interesting. Big topic, a lot of moving parts. Yeah. Okay, let's take a break for some audience questions. And the first one I will ask to you, Dan, and it could have many different answers. So whatever your answer is, if you want to answer. Are you ready? It says,
yes.
Looking back at your careers and work in the data management and data governance space, what do you think we need to stop doing, keep doing, and start doing to progress to the next level?
In 25 words or less.
Something like that.
I think the stop doing is thinking it's going to be easy, but because now everything that's digital, if it's digital, like if we already have this content, what it really boils down to is curation, is understanding, hey, I might have the data structure in the catalog, but no one has ever done a definition. And no one can really say, because I think the tools question a minute ago that Nick covered is great. Catalog is a foundational capability. Quality is a foundational capability. Hopefully those are tied together. And managing the difference between kind of a business glossary or business concept and how many different technical representations of it are there, like a customer number. You might have customer number in just about every system out there. But what do we mean by that? And, is there a common definition that then you can apply individual overrides to? So, the stop doing is essentially expecting this to be frictionless and easy. The start doing is to realize that, unfortunately, where the tools are, even after 15 or 20 years of evolution, the data governance and data quality and lineage tools are still not all inclusive. They need to be integrated with each other. You have to have a plan. How do I get my catalog talking to the data quality tool, even if they're from the same vendor, which is crazy. Because the reality of the software market is those companies acquire one another and they bring those tools into their portfolio and they kind of lightly integrate them. But I used to say, hey, I'm in the data catalog tool here and I can see the definition of that column. Now I'm over in the data quality tool. I can't see the definition of that column. So that's a problem. So, and then the idea of lineage, being able to trace these flows, that's a requirement on some regulatory reports to be able to trace the lineage. So we need to realize and start doing more, understanding the richness or depth of what we're talking about when we talk about data governance. Because I've had people say, well, we have a catalog, it's self-service. And I say, okay, what percentage of the definitions are missing? And in my former company, what we found is about 80% of the definitions in the catalog were from my business group only. And the other 19 business groups were responsible for the other 20% of the definitions. So we were clearly way overrepresented versus the population at large. So you have to have the courage to ask tough questions like that and to see, and realize data governance maturity is going to be different across the organization. There might be some groups out there where they've been doing it for years and they're very comfortable and it's just the way they do things there. Other groups, it's brand new to them. And they think they can implement their own tool and not use the enterprise tool, and that somehow that's okay. So there's lots to do, and I'm sorry if the answer was too long, but the reality is the stop doing, start doing, and continue doing question. No, there's a lot to cover there.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And one for you here, Nick. It says, how can firms ensure data governance through change management programs? Obviously, a lot can slip between the cracks or M&A. Or how can that be done?
Ensuring data governance through change management.
Data governance through change management, yeah.
This is an interesting question. I just was having a conversation around this, but it's important and to Dan's point earlier about ownership and the business being tied in, it's important for that connection between what the business is doing all the way down to how we're protecting the data how we're securing the data, like is connected. Like there needs to be an embed, like a common language across the business and embedded process that's validated, right? So like I remember years and years ago, I had an old CTO of mine used to say that, you know, your CMDB was garbage in, garbage out. If you couldn't validate your core process areas, control, configuration management, change management, incident management process, et cetera, right? And the same thing kind of applies here as well. So if the business is making a decision and making a service change, and that service change is now collecting different type of data that I'm not aware of, that I'm not protecting accordingly, or collecting more data than I was expecting, I now have a breakdown in the process. So making sure that that connection and validation, a compensating control is put in place to validate that is really critical.
Okay, thank you. Another one for you, Dan. Let's keep the answer short so we can get back to my questions. And this one, it says, why do data governance projects fail?
I seem to have frozen. Oh,
no, you're back.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, my
Sure.
screen froze for some reason.
Why do data governance projects fail?
A lot of reasons, but usually it's organizational. You know, there's a great survey by a guy named Randy Bean, New Vantage Partners. He's been doing it every year for the past, I think, 12 or 15 years. And it gets to the question of, you know, what are the obstacles to better data management and data governance? And one of the most common answers, you know, I think the overall question is what are the obstacles to becoming a data-driven organization? The technology is only about 8% of the obstacles. The other 92% is organizational and cultural and process. And, you know, that's very consistent with what I see in the real world is that, you know, the biggest cause of failure or, you know, lack of success, because no one ever admits failure. They're like, you know, oh, we didn't succeed, but we didn't fail. It's like, well, what did you do? It's organizational. It's, you know, changing horses in midstream, cutting off budgets, you know, a multi-year project that gets, you know, stops getting funded after 1 year, you know, not having a good answer for the what have you done for me lately question. Those are all problems. And people have short memories. They, you know, this fiscal year, everything is about data governance and regulatory compliance and, you know, investing in our infrastructure and our assets and so on. Next year, it's all about, you know, whatever, revenue, cost. So the kind of management attention spiral is something you always have to be on guard against, because, you know, the same people that are your biggest advocates this year might next year be trying to cut your budget. So I think there's always room for kind of worst case scenario anticipation, and how do you prevent that? And how do you remind people that, you know, just like finance, you're always going to have and need data governance, and that, you know, you can't come for our budgets next year if you have to cut everything across the board by 30%. You wouldn't do that to your finance organization, so you shouldn't do it to your data governance organization.
Okay, thank you. And another one for you, Nick, if I may. And it asks, it's about AI, something we touched on earlier. It says, please would the panel provide some guidance on how to integrate emerging AI apps into data governance? Obviously, this is something you talked about. This is something you need to be looking forward to. Have you seen it done yet? How can it be done?
We in heavily controlled, heavily regulated organizations, many of them have some type of, or had implemented early on, some type of machine learning committee or review process, right? Where they're looking at models, how the models are being used, where they're being used, what they're being used for, all of these types of things. That is just getting extended, right? The more we look at AI, the more we look at, you know, generative AI has been coming up a lot, Copilot slapped on top of Office 365 and whatnot. That same process, that same principle stays in place. Like, you need to document it, you need to understand it, and like everybody's got to be on the same page. You can't just turn the button on and let it go and then come back to it. Like we've done with technologies in the past. Like, this needs to be much more controlled. The second aspect of that is the data itself. And Dan touched on it, I think, in his one of the first things he said here today, is that, you know, I need to be able to understand my data because I need to understand the data that I have in the organization, because the data belongs to either the org, but in most cases it belongs to the consumer if it's personal information. I need to understand what I'm collecting. I need to make sure that I'm not introducing bias, because that extends from that's an AI problem. It can be a fair lending problem. It's a number of different problems. So understanding the data that's in these sources, the data that's getting used, as well as the models and why and the purpose I'm using them is extremely important. And like that should be step one. Like that's low-hanging fruit, easy to solve problems. And guess what? If you're solving those problems, you're also solving a lot of other problems along the way that's creating pain points for your privacy teams and for your information security teams and whatnot. Understanding what data is there, those types of things.
Okay. So back to the absolute basics of the data governance that we talked about earlier. Yeah.
Exactly. Basic blocking and tackling, right? So don't boil the ocean, because if you try to boil the ocean, you're going to get a teaspoon of salt.
Okay, excellent. Let's move on and let's run a final poll question. We might not have time to comment on it, but the question is, what extent of operational and business benefits does your organization gain or expect to gain from a successful implementation of data governance? And while you answer those questions, and again, you can tick as many boxes as appropriate. I'd like to come back to Dan to ask him, where are the operational and business benefits here? Sometimes it's very hard to justify things if you can't show benefit. What are the benefits here?
Well, I think, typically the drivers for this tend to be in 5 different categories. Revenue increase, which is always great, but not really very likely from data governance. But cost decrease or efficiency gains, certainly, automating manual processes, reducing time to value, et cetera. Third one is regulatory, and there's a big benefit there, although it kind of falls under the heading of defensive data governance rather than offensive. Then, decision-making quality, how to improve the decisions that are being made by the organization and make them more data-driven. So unfortunately, people have a tendency to set aside the data, and they're like, well, I understand I have all this information and dashboards and reports and so on, but what I really want to do is ignore all that and go with my gut. And then I think time to value, being able to improve the speed. We had one initiative that had to do with customer onboarding, and our goal was to reduce the onboarding process from 45 days, which of course is very long, to 5 days. And, in a very complex environment where we had a new customer, institutional, being set up for, all different kinds of trading activity with us. And we had to go update, anywhere from, 20 to 60 systems with their information because of our lack of integration and legacy systems. So very doable, but a lot of work to get there. So I think the benefits, they're huge operational benefits. You typically have to work in concert. So become very good and familiar at collaboration and communication and bringing people together, because oftentimes, the data governance people, for whatever reason, we were the glue. We were the ones that brought everybody together and said, okay, we need to have a meeting. It has to involve legal and privacy and security and compliance and audit and, IT and the business. And people would be like, that's a lot of work. But if we didn't do it, then nobody did it. And so having that ability to kind of corral all the interested parties and look at the problem holistically, whatever it might be, and say, okay, here are the changes we're going to have to make to solve this problem across all these different areas, and then make sure that actually got done. Act as almost the program manager to make sure that as the project went on, whether it was improving that one report or changing a regulatory process or whatever, that everybody did their part over a period of time until we got to the successful end of that project.
Okay, what would you add there, Nick? What kind of benefits can be taken from these kinds of programs, and what happens if you get it wrong?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about that question is it's an either or question. Is it an operational benefit or is it a business benefit? To me, they're interrelated, and you're getting both together. And like, if you look at something very simple, let's get super, super, super tactical and look at something very simple, like fulfilling a privacy rights request. If I've automated that, if the DBA is no longer, or a data owner or whoever's responsible is no longer having to go manually pull data or execute commands to pull data for Nick's data to fulfill a privacy rights request, which is pulling that person away from working on a project that has a business benefit. I'm accomplishing both things, right? So the data governance is like, these are interrelated benefits, and that is the beauty of it, but it's also the challenge. Like, we have to talk to each other in the same, with the same vocabulary, with that same goal, and understanding that if we do these things, we're going to operationally run better, and we're going to have better business benefits. We're going to drive value from the data at the end of the day is what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Let's leave that there. Let's have a quick look at the poll results, see how our audience thinks there. There you go. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for voting. I'm not going to have time for us to comment on that one, but because I'd like to come to our final question, and I'd like to ask both our speakers to offer some advice to practitioners who are working on data governance and data ownership. And Nick, can I come to you to start here? Some just quick points that our audience can take away.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it we've covered already. Like, go get tactical wins, get a quick win that's going to show value. Because one of the key things is making sure you've got really tight alignment across the business and across all stakeholders. Understanding your data. If you don't have the ability to classify your data, if you haven't classified your data and understand data classification, and if you can't tag your data accordingly, you're going to run into some challenges as well along the way. And automation, I think, would be the other thing. Look at areas where, don't think I'm going to go automate everything at once, but look at areas that you can go automate and catch some low-hanging fruit. And they're kind of, all those together will help you get those tactical wins.
Excellent.
Great point.
Some quick pointers from you, please.
Yeah, what I would say is, for practitioners, focus on the soft skills, realizing that data governance is inherently political. Focus on communication, collaboration, emotional intelligence, really, projecting and being empathetic, and understand, where people resist. It's not that they're resisting forever, but you want to understand why. Why are they objecting? What is their underlying, reason? What is their resistance? Where is it coming from? And how do I overcome that? So it's a surprising amount of sales and marketing needed in the data governance group to kind of get everybody on the same page and to get the group working as one to drive that collaboration. In the individuals, I'd say, become very comfortable with public speaking, build your executive presence, be a good listener, be a good manager, because a lot of times data governance is kind of thrust into the role of driving organizational transformation without anyone explicitly saying it. Because if you don't do that, then all the other things that depend on, the data being governed won't happen, because no one ever goes in saying, hey, our data is completely ungoverned, so the first thing we have to do is go govern the data. No, they always assume the data is perfectly governed already, and they want to do all these advanced things with it, like AI or whatever. And then they realize, oh, we have a lot of data work to go do. And you want to make that, an understood part of every process. Is going to be an upfront data portion before, and there's going to be a lot of kind of, convincing of people to realize that reality. So get good at persuasion, because you're going to need those skills a lot.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Dan, and thank you to both our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience today. And thank you too to OneTrust for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close, just a few 18 group events that may be of interest to you. Next week, you can join our RegTech Summit New York. That's next Thursday on the 16th of November. And looking into 2024, our next Data Management Summit will be in London. We'll be hosting that on the 14th of March 2024 in Canary Wharf. In terms of items that we are preparing and sharing with you, you can download the first edition of our Regulatory Reporting Handbook, essentially a comprehensive guide to reporting obligations on a global basis. So that said, that's it for today. So thank you very much indeed again to Nick and Dan, and thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views, and then we can improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.